Okay, so lecture number 13, Intro to Evolutionary Computing. A couple of notes before we get started on this lecture is that this is a bit of an anomaly in this course because there's only one lecture on the topic, but there is an assignment on the topic. So genetic algorithms, which are a part of evolutionary computation, will be what assignment 4 is about. And the basics of evolutionary computing and genetic algorithms are simple enough that they can be taught in one lecture and then give an assignment on them. And I think it's it's an important enough topic for you to at least know that this is a potential solution to a bunch of different problems. And just like search, implementing a single algorithm, if all you do is tweak the fitness function, just like you would tweak the cost in a search algorithm, you can solve a bunch of different problems with the same algorithm. So I think evolutionary algorithms are really cool. And so assignment 3 is due on Thursday in 2 days, and we will be giving out an assignment in this. In terms of difficulty of the assignment, I would say that assignment 4 and 5 are probably tied for the least amount of work that you actually have to do. It's a little bit tricky because you deal with arrays a lot in this assignment. So if you're not too familiar with arrays, it can be a little bit tricky, but it's not that bad, trust me. And I do have a warning about this later in the slides, but I'm going to give a little bit of biology in this lecture. And just a funny fact is that all through K-12 school, and the 15 years of university that I did, I have never taken a single biology course at any level of education. I've watched a lot of documentaries and stuff, but never actually taken a course. So I know just enough to have made these slides, but there will be nothing on the final exam about the biology. Only the algorithms and the theory of computation and stuff is what I'm going to be testing you. Don't worry if you don't know what meiosis is or what DNA stands for. That's not a big deal. So I'm going to be saying evolutionary computing, EC, evolutionary algorithms, which are the algorithms used for evolutionary computing. I'm going to be saying EA. And if I ever say GA, that's a genetic algorithm. So just to get that terminology out of the way quickly. So what is the positioning of EC? EC is a part of computer science and algorithm science, if you want to talk about it that way. It is not necessarily a part of life sciences or biology. I don't know if anyone here has taken a bunch of biology courses. Maybe there is now more of a computing focus in biology, and so these may be mentioned, but they are more of a computer science thing that was inspired by biology. So biology will deliver the inspiration and terminology for evolutionary computing, but not the algorithms part. So EC can be applied in biological research, but it has many possible applications. So just be aware that even though we're going to be talking about evolution, genetics, stuff like that, this is an algorithmic approach to problem solving that is completely generic. The domains that you apply it to do not have to be biological in nature. The main evolutionary computing metaphor has to do with taking inspiration from the real world and biology and evolution and applying that to algorithms somehow. And just to let you know before we get too deep into it, there is an entire course, I think it is 3201, which is nature-inspired computing, or at least that was the course topic that I looked at last time. And the reason there's only one lecture in this course is because this course is more of an intro to a bunch of different things, but that course will go into many more details about evolutionary computing if that's a course that you want to take to learn more about this. But we'll be learning enough to implement a basic version of it. So, in the real world, we have this process of evolution. And in computer science, we have this notion of problem solving. But if you think about it, we are, as entities in a universe trying to exist, we're trying to solve problems as well, right? We're trying to get food, we're trying to reproduce, we're trying to survive, etc. So that's sort of the metaphor, is that problem solving in computer science algorithmic terms is like survival in the evolutionary terms. So a problem that we would have in a computer science sense would be the environment in our metaphor for evolution, right? So the problem might be pathfinding, but we would phrase this as a problem of survival in an evolutionary context. And this will make a lot more sense once we get into it. In problem solving, we would have a candidate solution. So for example, in problem solving, or in pathfinding, when we did search, we're essentially looking at all the different paths that we could form and seeing which of them is the best. right? We'll be doing that as well in this, but instead of a candidate solution, we're going to be calling that an individual. So an individual entity trying to survive in this environment would be a possible path in our previous pathfinding example, if you want to look at it that way. And then the quality or cost of our path in the pathfinding problem would be, in evolutionary terms, the fitness. And so fitness is this evolutionary term which means sort of the chance of survival or reproduction in that environment, right? So quality, that would be this quality fitness thing. The quality of a solution might be something like the length of the path. So we want the smallest possible path. So in evolutionary computing, if we were applying, say, a genetic algorithm to find the shortest path, which we won't be finding paths in assignment 4, don't worry, we've done enough of that. But we would assign a high fitness to a better quality. That's all. So a lower cost path would have a higher fitness value. Evolutionary computing, just like a lot of artificial intelligence, has been around for a long time. I'm not really going to give any of the details on any of these because it's just, these is when these ideas were first came up in the literature, right? And so we have things like back in 48, Alan Turing just deserves so much more credit than the world has given to him. Like, not only the founder of all of these areas of computer science, but provided the single most, I'd say, of any individual in the world, besides perhaps one of the world leaders at the time, did the most to, like, win World War II, depending on which side you were on, right, than any other human being. Bremerin, Rechenberg, Fogel, Holland, Koza, all these the very famous names in computer science all thought of these different ways of applying evolutionary metaphors to computer science and algorithm. And I realize now that this looks like the year 3200, but no, this is this is the course number. Maybe I should have put 2025. But assignment 4 is being released on Thursday, not 1200 years from now. Okay, just keep in mind. So Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest. What does it mean? So I'm sure all of you have some idea of what evolution is, but let's go over the basics. So all environments in the real world have some sort of finite resources, right? I'm an animal. Let's say I'm a cow. I want to eat grass. There's a finite amount of grass. So if I eat the grass before someone else gets to, I might have a higher chance of survival over that other cow, right? And whatever trait gives me the ability to eat more grass would probably mean I have a higher chance of survival, which means I have a higher chance to reproduce and pass on my genes to the next generation, right? So there are finite resources. And then there might be lions who want to eat the cows, right? I'm not sure in what place on earth lions are eating cows, but you know, there are a finite number of cows that the lions have to eat. And so the lions have this sort of fitness level. And fitness does not necessarily mean fitness in the human, you know, I'm, you know, swole or whatever, or faster or stronger. It means you are just better suited for that environment, right? There are, you know, there are people who are better fit for specific things that have nothing to do with speed or strength. Like intelligence is another measure, right? If you can outsmart your enemy, that is another way of being fit for a particular environment. All life forms have some basic instinct or a life cycle geared toward reproduction, right? The secret to life, the meaning of life, if you've ever been searching for that, is basically kind of depressing. It's just whoever reproduces, there's more of them, right? That's why we're alive, is because our parents reproduced. And they're alive because their parents reproduced. And so the things that are better suited to adapt to survive in a given environment, like the dinosaurs, were pretty cool until the environment became unsuitable for them, right? Whatever happened to the dinosaurs, whether it was a meteor or volcanic, you know, ash or something covering the world, they were fit for the environment. And that's the thing. Something can change to make you unfit for the environment through no fault of your own, right? And so this is the process of evolution, is just reproduction. Who is more geared for reproduction? Therefore, since there are finite resources and nothing lives forever, therefore you have to reproduce, some sort of selection is inevitable, right? And so individuals that compete for resources most effectively have an increased chance of reproduction. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to reproduce. It means that your chance of reproducing is higher. Therefore, the law of averages, if you have a higher chance, then typically as time goes on, you will reproduce more, or people who share your traits will reproduce more. So just keep in mind, like I already said, fitness, this term fitness in nature is a derived secondary measure, right? So there is no way to measure, and so when we're talking about evolution, let's take modern day humans out of it, because we've kind of invented all this stuff that kind of goes against evolution. Like, if you think about medicine, it's taking people who were sick and making them better and stuff. Let's just talk about like animals and ancient things, right? So let's take all this technology out of it. And what I mean here is that fitness is a derived term, meaning there's no way that I can apply a function to somebody and get their fitness. In actual nature, the only way to measure fitness is to see which things have survived. So it's not really a measure, it's not a quantifiable thing. It's just that the things that are more fit are the ones that reproduce for that particular environment. So when we talk about evolutionary computing, we're going to apply a high fitness to individuals that we want to reproduce, right? Because they're the shortest path, or they're the lowest cost, or something like that. In biology, we have these terms genotypes and phenotypes. Phenotypes are the behaviors or physical differences that affect individual responses to the environment. They're partly, so phenotype, when I talk about phenotype, that is the actual thing, like the strength, the agility, the smartness that may contribute to your actual behavior in this environment. The genotype that we'll talk about later is the actual like encoding of that in your DNA or in a genome or something like that. So phenotype is the actual realization of the physical characteristic. Genotype is whatever code or DNA or whatever produces the phenotype. Phenotypic traits are partly determined by inheritance, partly by factors during development. So this is like nature versus nurture. I'm sure if any of you are sports fans, you've always heard the argument about like, oh, why was he so good at basketball, right? Well, of course, you can't learn to be 6'7" and palm a basketball with a giant hand. So there are some definite inherited traits that he received that made him a better basketball player, but also he worked harder than anyone alive at playing basketball, right? So you take those things, you kind of multiply them together, and you get this insanely talented individual at a particular thing. And so yes, anything that you do in life is affected by both nature and nurture. Nurture meaning your training, or your parents taught you to do something, etc. And this is unique to every individual, and it is partly as a result of random changes, which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about mutations and how they can affect things. Trait inheritance. If phenotypic traits lead to higher chances of reproduction, then these traits are passed on to offspring, right? So if you have two really tall people who have reproduced, there's a very high chance that their offspring are also tall, right? I'm sure you've seen that before. Someone has two tall parents and their kid is even taller than them. Along with random mutations, this leads to new combination of traits that ideally lead to more fit individuals, right? And when I'm talking about this is on average, right? Of course, there's always someone who could be born that is not taller than their parents or whatever, but in general, this is what happens over time. And so ideally, because these phenotypic traits that people have lead to higher chances of reproduction, their children are going to share some of those traits, and ideally, if the environment doesn't change too much, they'll be even better suited. So the population, this is some terms now that we'll be using when it comes to relating actual evolution to evolutionary computing. So the population consists of many possibly diverse individuals. Like we have a population of people here in the classroom. We have a population of people in the country, in the world, whatever scale you want to look at. We're going to have a population of candidate solutions in our evolutionary algorithm. So for example, every possible path might be a candidate solution that is in a population. So combination of traits that are better suited for given environments lead to a higher chance of reproduction. So what this means is that individuals in a population are the unit of selection. Okay, and I'll get back to this in a second. Variations occurring through random changes yield a constant source of diversity, and when coupled with selection means that the population is the unit of evolution. meaning that in order for Darwinian evolution to occur, individuals are the things that are being selected for reproduction. We are going to do this artificially in our algorithm by applying a fitness and assigning a higher chance of an individual to be chosen to reproduce based on that fitness. But in the world, two people choose each other to reproduce, right? Or two lions that are stronger have just lasted longer, so they end up reproducing. But the important thing here, and it is a common misconception when it comes to evolution, is that individuals do not evolve. The population evolves over time, okay? And it's through reproduction that you pass on genes that are potentially better for an environment, and over time, through the average of them have a better chance of being selected for reproduction, the population evolves. No individual evolves. Unless you're an X-Man or Spider-Man and your DNA gets changed by some, random event. But this process of living, reproducing, and dying has to happen in order for evolution to occur. So it's the population that evolves, not an individual. Genetics. Warning, I'm not a biologist. I said this already. I know just enough to talk about this, but not much more. So the information required to build a living organism is coded in the organism's DNA, okay? Consider this as a computer scientist. You may not have taken a biology course. Your DNA is your source code. It literally tells the universe how to put you together, okay? Genotype inside determines the phenotype. So your DNA, which is the genotype, determines the phenotype, which are the actual traits that you get later in life, right? So your DNA will determine partly how tall you are, what color your eyes are, what color your hair is, what color your skin is, stuff like that. Now, yes, it could also determine how strong you are or big you are or fast you are, but there are certain things that you can learn or train in real life that are not necessarily traits that are passed down, right? It's not like computer science knowledge is an inheritable trait, right? A bigger brain, yes, we've evolved bigger brains over time, so it may be easier to learn computer science, but learning is not evolution. Please distinguish those two things. The things that you learn how to do in your lifetime have nothing to do with evolution. Okay? Genotype to phenotypic traits is a very complex mapping. It is very difficult to just look at the DNA and figure out if someone is going to have what color eyes or if they're going to have 3 legs or something like that. One gene may affect many different traits, and many genes may affect one trait, right? If you think about source code, think about changing a few characters in the source code. It could affect a bunch of different things, and the effects of changing those things are very complex. Changes in the genotype may lead to changes in the organism, but they may not, right? There are some bits that you can change in your source code that may not have any actual effect on the running of the algorithm, but there are some that will. So, deoxyribonucleic acid, that is what DNA stands for, and I'll never say that again, and the nitrogenous bases, so A, T, C, and G. If you're looking at sequences of DNA, we've assigned these 4 letters to the 4 different things that actually make up DNA, so it's a sequence of A, T, C's, and G's. Genes are functional units of stretches of DNA on chromosomes, okay? So when we talk about a gene, we can sometimes look at a DNA sequence and say, oh, this sequence of A, T, C's, and G's is a gene which affects hair color, right? We can't always do that for every trait. We're still looking for a lot of them, but some things we can. And so the complete genetic material of an individual's genotype is called the genome. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Human Genome Project, which talked about mapping out the entire human genome. That was like decades ago now, but that's what this was doing. Human DNA is organized into chromosomes. Human body contains typically 23 pairs of chromosomes, which together define, the physical attributes of the individual. That's as deep as I'm going to get into it there. Reproductive cells. Gametes, which are sperm and egg cells, contain 23 individual chromosomes rather than 23 pairs. And gametes are formed by a special form of cell splitting called meiosis. And the context for me giving you this, even though I'm not going to test it, is to show that the algorithm that we will be eventually getting to has a basis in biology, right? We're going to be taking DNA from one parent and DNA from the other parent and merging it together to get a new possible candidate solution. During meiosis, the pairs of chromosomes undergo an operation called crossover, which is what we will be doing. Crossover shares genetic information from both parents to form a new offspring. So crossover can be as simple as this. You take part of this is one parent's DNA, this is another parent's DNA, and you literally cross them over. And so this genetic information is shared to this offspring, and this is shared to another offspring. Okay, and every time that couple has new offspring, different genetic material may be shared. And so, if two different color hair, maybe one baby has blonde hair, one baby has black hair, or something like that. There's always a chance that different parts of the DNA get shared between the parents. Different types of crossover can get increasingly complex. It's not as simple as this. There could be single crossover, double crossover, non-crossover gene conversions. There could be a bunch of different twists. There's all sorts of different ways that you can combine the genes from two parents into offspring. Fertilization. So sperm cell from the father, egg cell from the mother forms a new person. Okay? That's basically what happens. We get DNA from both of our parents. Genetic code. All proteins in life on Earth are composed of sequences built from 20 different amino acids. DNA is built from 4 nucleotides in a double helix spiral. The shape of that spiral was actually kind of insane how they figured that out. If you ever get a chance to watch documentaries about, I think it's Crick and Watson, those are two people who figured that out. It's very fascinating. Triplets of these form codons, each of which code for a specific amino acid, and the genetic code is the mappings from codons to amino acids. All of this is to say that different parts of our DNA affect different parts of those phenotypic traits, whether it be different cells in our body, whether or not we are born with cancer or one eyeball or a bigger brain or are more or less intelligent or fast or strong, etc. A lot of that comes from this DNA. We have been able to figure out, I say we like I had anything to do with it, but humans, scientists who are much smarter than I have been able to, especially in simpler organisms like the fruit fly, which has very simple DNA in comparison to humans, so it's been studied a lot, are able to map very specific parts of the DNA to very specific traits in the individual. So for some animals, organisms, this has been mapped out very well, but it is very, very complex for humans. And a lot of stuff has been mapped out, but the vast majority of it is still left. I'm not even going to start naming these things, but we have made strides toward mapping out the human genome. And whether or not you think this is a good or bad idea, like, okay, it's great. We may be able to do things like identify if a baby has a specific condition 20 years from now and treat it. But maybe also, now if two people get pregnant and they walk into the doctor's office, the doctor's going to say something like, what color do you want your baby's eyes to be? Right? Do you want them to be 7 feet tall or 4 feet tall? Right? So that's kind of the way things are going, but I guarantee that'll only be for the super rich. So maybe that's not a great thing that we are able to do all of this in the future. Mutation. I slightly hinted at this before, but occasionally, some of the genetic material changes very slightly during this process. This can be caused by different things. So, the environment is a weird, tangly, messy thing. Sometimes the DNA that gets copied over is not copied perfectly, just like in a computer, so there can be replication error. Factors in the environment, you have some rogue gamma ray from the sun flip a bit in your DNA, right? Whether that's good or bad, you could be born with no legs, you could be born with superpowers, right? So these mutations can lead to either good traits or bad traits, and we'll see that in a bit. So this means that the child might have genetic material that was not inherited from either parent. And this can be either catastrophic, right? Think of this in terms of randomly changing some characters in your source code. Right? Yes, if you write a program, someone could potentially change some characters randomly to make your program run faster, but more often than not, this is going to crash your program, right? This is sort of how I look at A lot of the times it could also be completely neutral, so you hit some bit that doesn't really matter. Or rarely, but advantageously, this could lead to new, stronger features in an individual, right? And it turns out that probably more so than in actual evolution, because in actual evolution, you don't really have this luxury of producing 1 million children with a very high rate of mutation and hope that a couple of them come out to be Superman, right? But in evolutionary computing, we do have that luxury. So the mutation rate that we're going to have in our algorithms is going to be much, much higher than we see in actual evolution. Some notes. Again, another common misconception about evolution is that individuals do not intentionally change themselves to suit an environment. There is no learning involved in that process, right? So some people would say, how did the giraffe know to grow such a long neck, right? It's not that at all. It's that over the course of millions and millions of years, some organism had some mutation that made their neck super long, and then they were able to eat the leaves that the other animals couldn't. And because they were able to eat something that the other animals could not, they survived, right? And so one super long-necked animal one time mated with something else that maybe didn't have the super long neck yet, and then they got a medium neck, right? And then some other mutation. I'm hand-waving a lot of this, of course. But there is no intentionality behind anything here. It is a selective process where the things that survive get a chance to reproduce, and along with some random changes over the course of millions of years, produces what we see. Fit individuals reproduce, unfit ones don't. And now, again, just keep in mind that fit individuals reproduce and unfit ones don't. That's the algorithmic view of things. We are going to assign a fitness to something and then choose that thing for reproduction based on the fitness. But this is actually the opposite of the real world, right? In the real world, we can't assign a fitness to something. So the things that reproduce, we call them fit. And the things that don't reproduce, we call them unfit, right? So it's kind of backwards, but the analogy is still there. So ideally, the good traits of the parents are passed to the offspring, producing individuals that are fitter than either parent. And random mutations can cause new traits to appear. And over time, this process produces more fit populations on average. Okay, so this is the process of evolution. And now you can start to see how that would be a cool thing if we could do that algorithmically. But first, a little story about a humanly observable process of evolution that has taken place within a lifetime. Some people don't believe in evolution. It doesn't matter if they believe that 2 + 2 = 4, it's still true, right? But this is actually an observable case that has happened. So somewhere in Europe, I believe it was the UK, but we'll just say Europe, during the Industrial Revolution, this process happened. So there was an animal called the peppered moth. It's called the peppered moth because in its normal state, the average peppered moth was kind of gray with some peppered black spots on it. And this peppered moth lived on this tree that looked a lot like it, right? And so it was its camouflage so that the moths that looked like the tree were less likely to be eaten by predators, whether they be birds or whatever else. Through some random mutations, people had observed over time that some of these peppered moths developed black colors, right? So these were not things that were taken from either parent, but some mutation over time. So darker colors appeared on some of these peppered moths. But of course, if you're looking over here, what happens if you're a bird? Well, this one sticks out like a sore thumb, so you can come eat this one very easily, right? So it's not that the darker ones are inherently not as strong or not as fast, right? Just the trait of being darker in this case was enough of a detriment that they didn't survive long enough to reproduce as much as the lighter colored ones. Then what happened? Well, the Industrial Revolution came along, and everywhere was all of this smoke coming out of these smokestacks, right? And the environment suffered greatly because of this. But one of the effects is that these lighter colored trees, due to all the soot and the carbon and whatever, started to become darker, right? And so what happened was, over time, as the trees became darker, the moths that had been randomly mutated to have a darker color were now the ones that were camouflaged. And so now the bird flying by can easily spot the lighter colored ones, right? And so through no fault of their own, the lighter colored moths became the one that were now less fit to survive in this environment because the trees changed color, right? So they're probably equally as fast, equally as strong, all their eyesight is the same, but just because the environment changed and their color is different, now the lighter colored ones are being eaten up and not reproducing as much, and the darker ones aren't being eaten as much and they are reproducing more. And because the darker ones are reproducing more, there are more children with darker color, etc. And so this is how like this peppered moth changed from being a species that was very light in color to very dark in color through evolution. They didn't like get smarter and like really try to change their skin color, right? It just happened by chance. And it could have been that if there was no mutation that changed their wing color, that they would have just went extinct, right? Because they all would have been eaten by these birds. And this has happened many times, right? If you think about a bunch of animals that humans have made go extinct over the years, right? We go into some jungle and cut down the entire forest, and now all this animal that just used to live there, they can't evolve wings in one generation and fly to a new continent where there happened to be a jungle, right? So those could no longer live in that environment because it had been changed so drastically. But in this case, they were able, I wouldn't say, some people would say they were able to adapt, right? But to me, adaptation is more of an individual thing where you learn something, but they were able to evolve and the new generations were better suited for that environment. So the motivation then for evolutionary computing is that nature has always served as an inspiration for engineers and scientists, and developing new problem-solving methods, in our case algorithms, is a very central theme, and it's kind of difficult to do. It's kind of difficult to just pluck a new algorithm out of thin air. So we're going to look at nature for some inspiration. So the complexity of problems to be solved increases. If we think of the A-star search algorithm or search in general, this process of try everything that's possible and pick the best one, as the problem space gets more complex, search becomes less and less viable because there are far more things that you want to do and you can't search all of them, so search becomes less viable as the problem space increases, or the complexity of the problem increases. And so over time, we care about more and more complex problems, and so we need more robust problem-solving technology. And so when these evolutionary algorithms were being invented, essentially there was a need to solve these more and more complex problems. And so someone said, let me try evolution. And evolutionary computing can simulate the evolutionary process with millions and millions of generations, right? So we don't need to wait millions of years to get the same result. We can do this in seconds or milliseconds if we're fast enough. So if we can model the problem in terms of an environment, individuals, and fitnesses, perhaps evolutionary computation can provide solutions. So here's an example that I actually worked on during my undergrad. So this was part of a project that I worked on with two profs who have now retired. So that makes me feel a little bit old. But essentially, exam scheduling at the university is like a tedious manual process, right? What they do is they kind of have figured out a general schedule that works and they kind of keep it the same every year. But if there is some conflict, like a new course comes in or something like that, or there's a new section opened up, then someone has to get in there and like manually tweak those things. And if you think about it, okay, here's the components in this problem. There are profs who have to be at the exam. There are students. There are rooms. There are courses. There are time slots. There are a bunch of constraints to satisfy. So no student or professor should have more than one exam at the same time. Obviously, that's one thing. No room can have more than one exam at the same time. And students shouldn't have more than 3 exams in one day, right? Stuff like this. It's a gigantic search space, right? It's exponential in each of these dimensions. Not only is it X and Y, it's X, Y, Z, alpha, beta, like all sorts of dimensions. So using evolutionary computing, we were able to come up with decent exam schedules by taking a potential schedule, which is a mapping of courses to time slots as the individual, and then the fitness of that problem would be something like okay, how many conflicts are there, right? So if we look at the conflicts and we say, okay, there were 27 courses that had conflicts. If another one had 10 conflicts, then the one with fewer conflicts had a higher fitness. And so that schedule had a higher chance to reproduce, right? So let's just say you take one schedule that has this many conflicts and another schedule over here, and you find some way of taking some of the scheduling from this one and some of the scheduling from this one, then you combine them into a new schedule. And if you've represented that in a way such that recombining them is an intuitive process, then ideally what you see over time through the process of doing that and through mutations, meaning, okay, change this course to be over here instead of in this room, then what we did see over time is the schedules getting better and better and better, meaning there were fewer and fewer conflicts. Question?
The fitness value here sort of like the evaluation heuristic from our Connect 4 assignments?
So the question was, is the fitness here like the evaluation from the Connect 4 assignment? It is like it, but in Connect 4 and in Alpha Beta, what we're doing is, because we're looking over every possible path, we are strictly taking the best thing as the thing that we want to do. But in evolutionary computing, typically, we are going to assign a probability of being chosen based on the fitness, rather than just always taking the best thing. And what that does is it still gives a chance at the not best thing of reproducing, because we don't want to have this, like, shallow gene pool, if you want to put it in that sort of jokey way. We want to have, even though we want the best things to go on to the next generation, we don't want only those few individuals reproducing. So there's always a chance that the unfit things can still survive, but even if it's still low. So that is one of the main differences. So the evolutionary computing metaphor, knowing what we know now. Populations of individuals exist within an environment with limited resources. Competition for those resources causes selection of fitter individuals to be better adapted. Those individuals reproduce to form a new generation of individuals through recombination and mutation. New individuals have their fitnesses evaluated. High fitness individuals are chosen to reproduce, pass on the good traits, and over time, this natural selection, or maybe unnatural selection that we're doing, causes the fitness to rise over time. So here's sort of a nice little animation of that. We have a population. Think of these as like ones and zeros or something in our representation for our genotype. This population gets evaluated via a fitness value. Then they are chosen for reproduction. Two parents have their genes cross over and then mutated, and then this forms a new population, and this just repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. So I'm about to explain all of these different steps now. And one of the groans or gripes, if you will, about evolutionary computing is that each of these steps can have about 50 different parameters that you're tuning, right? And so what I'm going to do is just give you some parameters for the assignment, and you don't really have to think about it much. But yes, each of these steps, how do I evaluate? What's the fitness function? How am I going to choose individuals for reproduction? How am I going to do the crossover? How am I going to do the mutation? How many people in the population? How many iterations per population? How many total evolutionary steps? It's a kind of a nightmare. But we'll just choose a set of things that's pretty simple, and we'll do it for the assignment. Just keep in mind that, yes, this becomes one of those, like, if you've ever seen like any old-timey videos of like an operator working at a telephone company, just turning knobs and doing, that's what it becomes in the end. So it's kind of annoying. So here is the algorithm for evolutionary algorithms. Initialize a population somehow, typically with randomized individuals, right? So if this was a pathfinding problem, it would mean that maybe if we have chosen to represent our individual paths as up, down, left, and right, we would put a random path in there. So we'd have some sort of population of some sort of size of some length of paths, okay? So initialize a population, and then you repeat until some termination condition. That termination condition has to be chosen by you. In our assignment, we'll just go forever. But if you're doing this in production for some company or for some research, this may be, I'm going to run it for a week, right? Because that's how many Amazon credits I have to use in the cloud. Or you may run it until, let's say that you know what the fitness is of a perfect individual, right? But you just don't know the individual yet. So you might be able to stop when you say, oh, my fitness is 1,000,000. I know that 1,000,000 is the highest possible fitness. So there's lots of different ways that you could stop here. Another way to stop is to say the highest individual fitness for any population has not gone up in 1,000 generations, stuff like that. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. But here's the algorithm. You take the population and you evaluate each individual's fitness. Then somehow you select parents from that population where you have a relationship between high fitness, meaning that you have a higher chance of being selected as a parent. You combine those parents somehow to form offspring. You mutate the resulting offspring, and then those offspring form the next population. That's it. Every single evolutionary algorithm is this algorithm. It's just that the representation, the fitness, and the parameters change. But this is the evolutionary algorithm. And there are different types of evolutionary algorithms, and you've probably heard of a bunch of them. And they have the difference between these algorithms is essentially, the main difference is just the representation of the genotype. Okay? So what is being held in that gene? Genetic algorithms are the simplest, in my opinion, so that's what we'll be doing on this assignment. And these will be either binary strings or integer strings. So think of an array of integers. That's what we're going to use as the representation for the genotype in our assignment. If that is your representation, then it's called a genetic algorithm. If instead you use real valued vectors, those are called evolutionary strategies. If you use finite state machines, they are called evolutionary programming. And if you use a tree structure, that is called genetic programming. And so they've just assigned different names to algorithms using different representations. Okay? So all of these come under the branch of evolutionary algorithms, which is a part of evolutionary computation. The differences are largely cosmetic. So it's best to choose a representation to suit the problem, right? And choose variation operators to suit the representation. So you're looking at your problem. For our algorithm, for our assignment, we're going to be trying to solve a Sudoku puzzle. And so a natural way to represent a Sudoku board is a list of integers, right? Because Sudoku has integers in it. But if I wanted to do something, for example, use evolutionary algorithm to write a program to do something, which you can, then you could represent your code in a tree structure. And I'll show an example of that a little bit later. So here are the main components of an EA. It's the representation. So what are the values you're assigning to individuals? The evaluation or fitness function that you're applying to the individuals. The population. So what is the length of each individual? And what is the size of the population? What is the parent selection mechanism? There are a bunch of different ways to take a bunch of fitnesses and choose parents from that. What are your variation operators? So how do you recombine two things into one or two other things? How do you mutate things? What are your survivor selection mechanisms, etc.? So there are lots of different things to vary in an evolutionary algorithm. So representation is probably the most important thing. So your candidate solutions, your individuals, exist in a phenotype space. So the phenotype is the actual candidate solution. So we're going to start talking about who here knows what Sudoku is. Please tell me. So Sudoku is just a puzzle where you have to put numbers on a board such that they satisfy some conditions. I'll talk about that way more when we talk about the assignment. It's a very easy thing to conceptually understand. So the phenotype for Sudoku would be the actual Sudoku board, the 9x9 board with the numbers in it, okay? The genotype for a Sudoku board would be a representation of the phenotype as a one-dimensional array of numbers. So it's very easy for us to take a Sudoku board, which is a 9x9 set of integers, and turn it into a length 81 set of integers, right? That's a very easy thing. But for some things like exam scheduling, how do you take exams at times in rooms and turn that into integers? Well, that's a little bit more complex. I'm sure you could all do it, but it's a little bit more complex. So they are encoded in chromosomes and exist in the genotype space. So the genotype is the representation that we will actually be doing the algorithm on. So the algorithm works on the genotype, not the phenotype. So encoding is taking the phenotype and turning it into a genotype. But after we work with the genotypes and cross over and mutate them, we have to turn them back into the phenotype. And so this has to be a one-to-one representation, right? You have to be able to take one, turn it into the other, and then turn it back. So just make sure that that is that's satisfied when you're choosing your representation. In order to find the global optimum, every possible solution must be able to be represented in the genotype space. What does this mean? Well, let's say, for example, we're trying to do Sudoku, but we don't allow any 9s to be in the genotype. Could we possibly find the best answer? No, because we can't represent every possible Sudoku board, right? Now, if in our representation for a Sudoku board, we allowed numbers from 1 to 20, could we find the best answer? Yes. Will it probably take longer? Also yes, right? So not only are you trying to represent things such that the global optimum solution could be there, but also you're trying to select the minimum set of things so that the global solution could be there. So here's our example, phenotype of a Sudoku board into the genotype. And so what I did here was just take, I just go from left to right on each row, 5, 3. If there's nothing there, it's a 0. 5, 3, 0, 0, 7, 0, 0, 0, 0, 6, 0, 0, 1, 9, 5, etc., etc. Okay? So, the fitness function. We've talked about this, but how are we going to actually implement this? So this represents an estimate of how well an individual will perform in a given environment. How fit are they to reproduce? Assigns a real valued fitness to each phenotype, which forms the basis for selection. The more fine-grained different values, the better. Okay, so the more fine-grained you're able to get with your fitness function, that's really good. And usually what we do is we talk about a fitness being maximized in genetic algorithms. And typically, if you have, for example, let's say we're trying to minimize a cost, we would turn that into a problem where we're actually maximizing it. So maybe we take the negative of it, or 1 divided by it, or something like that. So we'd be maximizing things in this case. So an example fitness function. How would I take a Sudoku board and find a fitness for that, right? You could probably think of a million different ways to assign a fitness to a Sudoku board. By default, for the assignment, what I'm going to do, so just for those of you who don't know Sudoku yet, you have a 9 by 9 grid. Ignore the things on the outside. This is actually 10 by 10, but that's just a representation of the fitness. So I take this 9 by 9 board, and Sudoku has 3 stipulations. The same number cannot appear twice in the same row, twice in the same column, or twice in the same square. And by twice, I mean 2 or more times. It has to be unique in each of those things. So the not completely naive solution that I came up with at first is just to count the number of unique things in each row, each column, and each square. Okay? So there are how many unique things in this one? There are 6. So there are 6 unique values. If it had 9 unique values, it would be better, because then there would be all unique values in that row. Down here, let's check this column. There are 8 unique things in this column because there are 2 4s. Right? So again, 8 is not optimal, but it's pretty close, right? So this one might have a high chance of reproducing, right? Or no, don't ignore that because it's not the whole thing. So what I did then, if you sum up all the if you took a solved Sudoku board, then the maximum possible fitness value using this fitness would be 81 times 3, right? So what's that? 243? So a solved Sudoku board would have a fitness of 243. There you go. That's what it is. As part of the assignment, one of the bonuses is to possibly come up with a better fitness function than that. And by better, I mean your genetic algorithm is going to produce a solution faster. Okay? Now, in the assignment, okay, I'm not going to say any more about the assignment, but it's very unlikely that you're going to actually solve a Sudoku board using a GA in this way, and that's by design, and I'll get to that more when we talk about the assignment. But this is just an example of a fitness function. You take a representation, and you figure out a value to go along with that representation. There's lots of cool examples online of people implementing genetic algorithms to do really flashy animated stuff. Sorry that we're not doing that for this assignment, but in this one, what this problem is the genetic algorithm somehow encodes the muscular and skeletal structure of this organism, and then it just starts to walk, and the further it walks, the better the fitness. So the fitness is just how far did it walk. That's it. And then over time, you get things that are, by later generations, they are actually doing better and better. Okay, so the population holds a representation of possible solutions, usually has a fixed size. So we'd say, okay, we're going to choose 500 as our population. Typically, you want the biggest population that you can handle in a reasonable amount of time, okay, for your computing hardware. Some sophisticated EAs assert a special structure on the population. We won't necessarily do that. Selection operators usually take whole populations into account, and the diversity of the population refers to the number of different fitnesses, phenotypes, and genotypes, right? We wouldn't want to have 900 copies of the same thing in 1,000 population. So this is basically a population. You could picture this as one of our Sudoku boards, and then we'd have just like 100 of them or 500 of them or whatever in a particular population. Parent selection mechanism. How do we choose who the parents are? We are going to assign variable probabilities of individuals as parents depending on their fitness. This is usually probabilistic, so high quality solutions are more likely to reproduce, but not guaranteed. The worst candidate solution typically has a non-zero chance of being selected. So that just means that everything has some chance of being selected, no matter how bad it is. But it could be very, very, very small. This stochastic nature can help us to escape local optima. I'll show an example of what that means in a little bit. So we are going to use for our assignment this algorithm called roulette wheel selection. And essentially what we're going to do is it's like spinning a roulette wheel, or so this is a roulette wheel in a casino. You just spin it and the ball lands on one of them, except instead of an equal chance of landing on each of them, we are going to assign bigger spots based on the fitness, right? So whether that's a linear relationship or a quadratic relationship or whatever relationship you want, let's just say it's linear for now. That's how we're going to do this selection. The algorithm for this, you can also think about it as a dartboard. So if I just like blindfolded you and you threw a dart at the dartboard, then let's assume you can actually hit the dartboard while blindfolded, right? But the things that take up the more space in the dartboard are going to have a higher chance of being selected. So that's this roulette wheel selection. Let's go through a numerical, an actual tangible example before I get to the algorithm. So let's say I have a population of 6 individuals, and these are the fitnesses of each individual, okay? So the sum of each the sum total of all the fitnesses is 200. I've cherry-picked these, obviously, so that the graph looks nice and so that it's understandable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another data structure called sum. And this is the sum of all the fitnesses of everything up to that point so far. So up to individual 1, it's 10 because there's only been 1. I add 30, I get 40. I add 5, I get 45, and so on, up until the very last one where I see 200. So if I look over here, right, at this pie chart representing these fitnesses, it should be the case that individual 4, because it has half of the total sum fitness, this is going to be chosen as a parent 50% of the time. So what is the algorithm to do that? It is dead simple. Pick a random number, r, from 1 to the end sum. Let's say that that value is 81. I don't know, just chose 81 because I was thinking of Sudoku. What you do is you go over this sum list, and wherever you see a value that is over 81, you stop and you pick that individual. That's it. Is 10 over 81? No. Is 40 over 81? No. Is 45 over 81? No. Is 145 over 81? Yes. Therefore, I pick this. Okay? Couldn't be a simpler algorithm. You just sum everything up, pick a random number between 1 and the sum, and go down until you find something. Here's the algorithm for that. I just wrote it there. I don't need to go through it because you know how it works now by going through that example. But this is, you will be implementing that on the assignment, so I put it there for you. Next, variation operators. Our role is to generate new candidate solutions from parents to offspring. Usually, this is divided into two types of variation operators, a mutation operator or a recombination operator. So mutation is one input where you change something. So maybe for our Sudoku example, we have a Sudoku and we're going to change a 5 to a 7. Does that make a better solution? Maybe, maybe not. Recombination for our assignment is just going to be taking two parents and recombining them to form two offspring. So most EAs use both recombination and mutation. Recombination for our assignment is going to be dead simple. You have one array of integers, you have another array of integers. You are going to form two children from those two parents. The two children are the first half of one parent, the second half of the other parent, and vice versa. Couldn't be easier. The mutation operators could be varied, right? So there's two ways to do different mutations. I'm not sure if we'll get to that when we talk about the assignment, but one way to do a mutation is to take two values in the array and swap them. Another way to do mutation in an array is just to take a value and change it to another legal random value. Okay, so we can do mutation in several different ways. There are a bunch of different ways that we could do crossover. So there is like 1 point crossover, meaning that we choose a specific index to do the crossover at. It doesn't have to be the middle, right? We could have multiple point crossover, where we take a bunch of different values from a bunch of different places. We could have uniform crossover, where we sort of choose randomly from each parent where we are going to take each one from. There's lots of different types of crossover. I'm just going to be doing this one, where we split it in the middle. Okay? Now, I'm going to have a part of the assignment where I say, if you have that, that's fine, but you could do another part, another type of recombination, if you think, for some reason, that this other type of recombination is better suited to solve Sudoku, right? So you might think, well, if I take the middle value in Sudoku, that's kind of taking like okay, that's like the first 3 rows, the first 4 squares and half of another one. Maybe should I actually cut that off at like the end of a square or the end of a row or the end of a column? I'm not sure, right? So it'll be up to you if you want to come up with a better Sudoku crossover or mutation strategy. The last part that we're going to do on the assignment is something called survivor selection, also called environmental selection. Most EA use a fixed population size and need a way of going from parents and offspring to the next generation. And so typically, okay, the main idea behind this is that we want to somehow ensure that the next population is at least as fit as the previous population. And one of the ways to do this is called elitism selection. And so I'm going to give you a percentage. Maybe that is 1%. So for example, if our population is of size 500, 1% of 500 is 5. So every single new generation, you're going to take the 5 best fitnesses from the previous generation and just copy them into the new generation. And by doing that, you're ensuring that your fitness function can never go down. It will either stay the same or go up, right? Because if we don't do something like that, there is a chance that non-high fitness things could reproduce and our fitness could actually go down over time. So this is something that you will see is actually quite useful. Initialization and termination. So initialization is usually done randomly. I'll have code for that for you in the assignment. But for a Sudoku board, you can pretty easily come up with a randomization strategy. Okay, for each place on the board, pick a number from 1 to 9, right? Or maybe you could say, well, that might be good, but how about I pick 1 through 9, each of them 9 times, and then shuffle them or something like that, right? So there could be different ways to initialize it, but we're just going to choose random. And the termination condition could be some known or desired fitness. Maybe we reach a generation limit, so only go for 1,000 generations, meets some sort of minimum diversity, generation limit of no improvement, etc. So this is what we've just gone over. We take a population, we evaluate it using fitnesses, we choose some things to reproduce based on those fitnesses, we take those parents, we cross them over, then we mutate them, and then from these offspring, we form a new population. That's it. So it's actually a pretty simple algorithm conceptually. So here's what we're going to see as typical behavior of an evolutionary algorithm. Let's say that the x-axis of this graph represents possible solutions to our problem. And then over here, this represents the fitnesses of those possible solutions. And if you've ever done much with math or computer science, what you're going to see is that most problems are not what we call a convex optimization problem. So a convex optimization problem is one in which there is a single global maximum, right? And not only a single global maximum, but a single local maximum. So that means that as long as you're constantly making progress, you are guaranteed to eventually find that local, or that local maximum, which is also the global maximum. But most interesting problems don't work like that. Most interesting hard problems have a bunch of local optima, right? And so what happens is your initial population is going to be these dots. Okay, so these are our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Our population of size 9 are probably going to fall on some distribution of those maxima, of those fitness functions. Over time, an evolutionary algorithm is going to take those and move them toward that optima. So we're going to see, okay, this guy started climbing, maybe this one started climbing here, this one started climbing here, these started going up, and so we see this, and then we see this. But a lot of the time, we're going to have a bunch of local maxima that are not the global maxima, and our solutions can get stuck there, okay? And in Sudoku, this is absolutely the case. Look at this. We have an almost solved Sudoku board, okay? So down here, we have a Sudoku board, except there are 2 3s in this column, and there are 2 1s in this column. Anyone who has played Sudoku can tell you that even though this is very close, it's only 2 away from the optimal fitness function, you may never get to the optimal from here, right? Because changing one of these is going to actually affect the row and column and the squares. If you change that 3 to the 4 that's missing in the column, maybe now there's 2 4s in that row or that square, right? And so this, what we see here, is probably one of these local optima, right? Where in order to get this from almost solved to perfectly solved, we have to make some crazy mutation to bump it over to one of these other hills so that can actually get to a global optima. I chose Sudoku for this specific reason, to show you how, like, in the real world, a lot of these problems are like this. Genetic algorithms, in my opinion, are truly excellent for problems where I want to get close enough really quickly in a gigantic problem space. But it is very unlikely that I'm going to ever reach the true global maximum, okay? It can very easily, very quickly climb to one of these local maximums, but it's unlikely that you'll ever be able to take this and through a few random mutations or crossovers, turn it into a solution, right? So what we're going to have on the assignment is the standard 9x9 Sudoku. You'll probably be able to get to a point like this where you're almost solved, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually solve a 9x9 Sudoku on the assignment. It's just very difficult by the nature of the problem and the way that we're trying to solve it. So also, keep this in mind for when you go to choose an algorithm to solve something, right? If your boss comes to you and says, I've got a million different parameters, and I'm trying to find those parameters so we can get below a cost of $100 per month, or whatever it is. GAs are great for that sort of problem, where you do not have to find the optimal solution. Especially in combinatorial spaces like this, they're kind of bad at finding global solutions. But if your problem is convex like this, they can solve them right away. But if your problem is convex, you probably use like some other algorithm like gradient descent that's just better for those problems, right? But just keep in mind that we will also have on the assignment, for the same board, I'll have different problems. So one will be Sudoku, but another one would be just get the biggest sum of all the numbers. And that is a convex problem, and so you'll be able to solve that very, very easily, right? So all of these things are just things to keep in mind. So a typical genetic algorithm run is going to look something like this. So here's time, the number of generations going from left to right. Here is, and typically what we're going to do is we're going to graph the best fitness of anything in the population. Because typically what we do when we want to use a GA to do something is you let it run for a long time, and then at the end you're going to take the best one, and that's your solution that you're going to implement somewhere. It turns out that GAs get very, very close to optimal in a very short amount of time, and then spend a ton of time at that very last part trying to get the last few numbers. Here is a graph that is actually taken from our assignment. So I have this graph that is shown in real time during your assignment as your GA runs. This graphs the maximum fitness of a population, which is the blue line, the average fitness of the population, which is the black line, and the minimum fitness, which is the bottom line. So what you can tell from this is that this population is fairly diverse. It has at least some very low fitness things. It has a few high fitness things, and the average is somewhere in between, right? So we can have a look at this graphically to say, okay, this is kind of a healthy distribution of the diversity of this population. But what about this one? Well, if the minimum, the average, and the maximum are all that close to each other, we're basically inbreeding the whole population. Like we've got royal family levels of inbreeding going on here, right? So the top couple of fitness individuals are just mating with each other all the time. And it turns out that another thing that I haven't talked about yet, the reason why we're able to get this type of graph is because the other thing for the assignment is that I'm going to give you a number like 10%. So if you have 500 things in your population, 10% is 50. I'm going to say every population put 50 random things into the population, every new generation. And that just ensures that there's always some randomness floating around. Like there's always some new person moving into the community that you could possibly mate with, right? I don't know, that's a bit creepy, but that's sort of the way of looking at it, yeah. So here is the algorithm again, just so you have it. Pretty simple algorithm. As I said before, there are different types of GAs. I just really quickly wanted to show you genetic programming because I think that it's absolutely fascinating. So trees can represent a bunch of different structures. So over here we have mathematical operations, we have source code, we have Boolean formulas, and we can take these and turn them into trees, right? So if you've ever worked with Lisp or any of these other languages that have tree-like representations of formulas, you'll be very familiar with this. But what we have here is 2 times pi plus x plus 3 minus y divided by 5 plus 1. That's a tree structure of representing this formula. This is a tree structure for this Boolean formula, and this is a tree structure for this source code. So you can have a tree represent source code in your population. And then for parents, you might say, well, how can we recombine things that aren't the same length? Well, it turns out that now when you have trees with subtrees, you could talk about picking a subtree to swap. And so this offspring gets this subtree, and this offspring gets this subtree. And mutations could be flipping a value, flipping an operator, removing a subtree, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can represent things using EAs that are not simply, how do I represent things as integers? But that's going to be our assignment, because it's like, I don't want the assignment to be the headache of programming trees to represent things. But you can absolutely have trees that represent programming languages that you can write and evolve programs, which is pretty cool. There is this really great example here. If I can bring this up real quick, what is this saying? Do you want to keep your annotation? Nope. I think so. This is a really cool example, and what happens in this one is that we have a population of cars, and they are represented by some integers. Those integers represent the angles between each face of this polygon, representing the body of the car, as well as the radius of each wheel and the end of which of these polygons or line or vertices that the wheel is actually attached to. And then there's some physics simulation, and the physics simulation just spins the wheels, right? And whoever goes furthest has a better chance of reproducing. And you get some pretty crazy examples here. And I think they stop it once they stop moving. And so, oh, well, you can tell this one's going to do well. But look at this one. This looks like, in just a few iterations, like you're getting some pretty neat things, right? So you can tell as a human, okay, if I had to design a car to navigate, this is actually doing crazy well. Anyone played Line Rider, that game that sort of looks like this? So you can already tell that, like, you want the wheels to be far apart, but not too far apart. You want there to kind of be like a little angle so you don't get stuck on these things. But the genetic algorithm is just, it's doing this. So what happens is you start with an initial randomized population. You evaluate their fitness by driving them forward. Then based on the fitness, you select the higher fitness ones to reproduce. You take maybe, you know, however you recombine the properties of the parents to form an offspring. That produces the next generation. Maybe you, and you can see here how they're all sort of looking similar now, because more and more parents are recombining to form the same sort of traits. And you can change like all these different mutation rates and stuff. And I wish I was as cool as whoever programmed this to do it for your assignment, but also the source code for this is out there. So, you know, ours is going to be a bit simpler, but still pretty fun, I think.